Imagine that we are not the first. Imagine that before us, other humanities walked this very same planet and disappeared. Not once, not twice, but at least 20 times. 20 different types of humans, 20 different ways of thinking, of hunting, of raising their children, of looking at the sky and wondering what they were doing here. Some were stronger than we are. Others had brains as large as or even larger than our own. Some mastered fire when our species didn't even exist. And yet, they all went extinct. For millions of years, the Earth was a continuous experiment. Over and over again, evolution produced humans. Over and over again, those humans vanished as if someone had pressed a reset button. The unsettling thing isn't that they failed. The unsettling thing is that we are the exception. Because if history repeats itself, and in biology it almost always does, the uncomfortable question isn't what happened to them. The question is, what makes us think that this time will be different? Today, we are going to explore that lost tree of humanity, the branches that broke, the species that were erased, and the possibility that we are not the end, but simply the latest chapter written so far. For a long time, we were told a very specific story about human evolution, an image almost etched into our collective memory, a neat line of figures that start hunched over, gradually straighten up, and end with us. A ladder, simple, clean, with a clear destination. But that image is profoundly false. Human evolution was not a straight line. It wasn't a continuous progress towards something better. It was a chaotic process, full of branches, setbacks, and dead ends. Rather than a ladder, it was a thick bush, a tree full of branches growing at the same time, competing with one another, and, in most cases, breaking off. While one species was learning to walk upright, another was perfecting its climbing. While some developed simple tools, others bet on more robust bodies or sharper senses. There was no master plan. There was no final goal called Homo sapiens. For millions of years, several human species coexisted on the same planet, sometimes even in the same regions. They crossed paths, they competed, they intermingled, or they replaced one another. We are not the inevitable result of evolution. We are a possibility that survived. And understanding that changes our perspective completely. Because if there was no ladder, then there is no guarantee that we are on the top step. To understand how this entire tree of human branches began, we have to go back even further, to the moment when our ancestors stopped moving like apes and took a step that changed everything. Several million years ago, Africa was not as it is today. Dense jungles began to fragment. The climate became drier, more unpredictable. The trees, our refuge for millions of years, started to drift apart, and our ancestors were forced to make a choice: either cling to a world that was disappearing or climb down to the ground. Walking upright was not a planned advancement. It was a desperate response to a changing environment. By standing up, those early hominids gained something crucial. Their hands were free. Free to carry food, free to manipulate objects, free, without knowing it, to begin an irreversible transformation. But bipedalism came at a price. Walking on two legs is inefficient. It causes back pain, childbirth complications, fragile joints. From a purely biological standpoint, it is not a perfect solution. And yet, it worked. Because by freeing the hands, the door opened to a new way of interacting with the environment, and with it, something slowly began to change inside the skull. Not all at once, not like an explosion. The brain didn't grow first, it grew afterward. Bipedalism didn't make us intelligent, but it created the conditions for intelligence to emerge later on. It is important to understand something here. This change didn't happen in a single species, nor in a single evolutionary line. Several human branches tested this strategy. Some survived for millions of years, others vanished. And one of the first to leave a clear mark on the fossil record was a creature that already walked upright, but was still very far from being human as we imagine it today. About 3.2 million years ago, in East Africa, lived a creature that was not an ape, but wasn't human either. We know her as Lucy. Lucy belonged to the genus Australopithecus, one of the first clearly bipedal branches of our history. She walked upright habitually, something that already radically separates her from today's great apes. But that is where the similarity to us ends. Her brain was small, barely a third the size of ours. Her body was designed for two worlds at once, her legs for walking long distances, and her arms, still strong and long, for climbing trees. Australopithecus had not entirely abandoned arboreal life. They slept in the trees, took refuge in them, and escaped predators from the heights. It was an evolutionary compromise. They weren't defective prototypes on the way to something better. They were complete solutions for a specific environment, and they worked. The Australopithecines survived for more than 1 million years, a resounding success in evolutionary terms, much longer than our own species has lasted so far. But there was a limit. Their small brains restricted their ability to plan, manufacture complex tools, or exploit new food sources. Bipedalism had opened a door, but no one yet knew what to do with it. That next step wasn't taken by them. It was taken by another branch of the human tree, one that understood that the environment could be modified, not just endured. That is where something new begins, not a physical improvement, but a technological shift. About 2.5 million years ago, something changed irreversibly in human history. It wasn't a change in posture. It wasn't a spectacular increase in body size. It was an idea. For the first time, a human species began to manufacture tools intentionally. We call this branch Homo habilis, literally handyman. And although their appearance was still primitive, short with long arms and a still modest brain, their relationship with the world was completely new. Homo habilis began to nap stones, not at random, but with purpose. The first tools were simple, sharpened pebbles, stone flakes with cutting edges, but their impact was enormous. They allowed them to cut meat, break bones, and access marrow, an extremely rich source of energy. This created a decisive feedback loop. More meat meant more calories. More calories allowed for the maintenance of a slightly larger brain. A somewhat larger brain made it easier to manufacture better tools. And so, little by little, the brain began to grow, not by chance, but because it was useful. For the first time, human evolution stopped depending solely on the body and began to rely on something external, technology. Homo habilis did not master fire. They did not build complex shelters. They probably did not have articulate language, but they had crossed an invisible line. The world was no longer just an environment to adapt to. It was something that could be manipulated. And that change had profound consequences, because once survival depends on tools, intelligence stops being a luxury and becomes a decisive advantage. From this point on, human evolution accelerated, not because the body changed quickly, but because culture began to keep pace with biology. The next species took this idea to the extreme. They didn't just survive, they dominated the planet for longer than any other humanity. If we had to point to the most successful human species in history, it probably wouldn't be us. That title belongs to Homo erectus. They appeared nearly 2 million years ago and survived for more than 1.8 million years.
To put that into perspective, our species has been on Earth for barely 300,000 years. Homo erectus was not a brief transition, it was a biological empire. They were the first humanity to leave Africa and colonize vast regions of Asia and Europe. They walked thousands of kilometers, adapting to cold climates, jungles, savannas, and deserts. And they did it thanks to a decisive combination of changes. Their bodies were taller, more robust, with surprisingly modern proportions. Their long legs allowed them to cover great distances efficiently. They were no longer a creature of compromise between trees and the ground. They were fully terrestrial. But their true leap was cultural. Homo erectus was the first human species to master fire. They didn't just use it occasionally, they controlled it. Fire allowed them to cook food, making digestion more efficient and releasing more energy for the brain. It provided warmth, protection from predators, and a social gathering point. The night ceased to be an absolute limit. With fire came something more subtle: time. Time to interact, to learn, to pass on knowledge. The tools of Homo erectus also became more sophisticated. Symmetrical hand axes appeared, manufactured with clear and repeated intent. This suggests planning, learning, and perhaps teaching. And yet, even this extraordinarily successful species disappeared. They didn't collapse overnight. They weren't erased by a single catastrophe. They simply ceased to exist. Their lineage fragmented into new branches. Some evolved, others went extinct, and among those branches, even more mysterious humanities emerged, some so close to us that today they live on, within our own DNA.
For a long time, we believed that human history was more or less complete. Neanderthals in Europe, sapiens in Africa, a few intermediate transitions, and then a bone appeared. In 2010, in a remote Siberian cave called Denisova, archaeologists found something seemingly insignificant, a tiny finger fragment, not even a full skeleton, just a minute remnant. But its DNA told a completely unexpected story. It didn't belong to a Neanderthal. It didn't belong to Homo sapiens. It was another humanity altogether. We called them Denisovans. The unsettling part is that even today we know almost nothing about their physical appearance. We don't know their exact height, their faces, or their material culture with any clarity. We only have a few bones and their genetic footprint. And that footprint is deep. The Denisovans interbred with other human species, with Neanderthals, and with sapiens. Today, certain modern human populations, especially in Asia and Oceania, carry Denisovan DNA within them, not as a genetic curiosity, but as a real advantage. An extraordinary example is found in Tibet. Tibetans can live and work at high altitudes where oxygen is scarce without suffering the devastating effects other humans would face. That ability didn't evolve in Homo sapiens. It was inherited directly from the Denisovans. In other words, an extinct human species is still alive inside of us. The Denisovans didn't disappear completely. They dissolved genetically into other humanities. They are evolutionary ghosts. They remind us of something uncomfortable. Human evolution was not a clean competition where one winner replaced everyone else. It was a complex web of encounters, crossings, mixtures, and disappearances. Some species went extinct, others were absorbed, and the most disturbing thing is that we don't know how many other humanities existed or how many were lost without leaving a trace. But if the Denisovans were a genetic mystery, there is another species that challenges something even more basic, our very idea of size, intelligence, and survival. In 2003, on a remote Indonesian island called Flores, archaeologists found something that looked like a mistake, a human skeleton, but barely 1 meter tall. At first, it was thought to be a Homo sapiens with some kind of pathology, but the more the remains were analyzed, the more evident the truth became. It wasn't a deformity,
It was another human species. We call them Homo floresiensis, though they quickly earned a more evocative nickname, the Hobbit. They lived until just 50,000 years ago. In other words, while Homo sapiens was already expanding across the planet, these small humans were still living, hunting, and surviving on an isolated island. Their brains were small, much smaller than ours, even smaller than those of Neanderthals. And yet, Homo floresiensis manufactured stone tools, hunted animals, including pygmy elephants, and mastered their environment effectively. How was this possible? The answer lies in a phenomenon known as insular dwarfism. On islands with limited resources, evolution favors smaller bodies that require less energy. It is not an anomaly, it is a strategy. Homo floresiensis was not a defective version of us. They were an optimal solution for a very specific environment. And this strikes once again at an idea we take for granted, that a large brain is always synonymous with superior intelligence. The Hobbit proves to us that intelligence doesn't depend solely on brain size, but on organization, adaptation, and culture. For thousands of years, these small humans thrived without the need to grow larger, without the need to look like us. And yet, they disappeared. Perhaps because of the arrival of Homo sapiens, perhaps due to environmental changes, perhaps a combination of factors. We don't know for certain. But their existence raises a haunting question. How many valid ways of being human have existed, and how many have we lost because they didn't fit our current definition? And if Homo floresiensis challenges our idea of size and intelligence, there is another humanity that forces us to look directly into the mirror. A species so close to us that for a long time they were treated as a caricature. For decades, Neanderthals were portrayed as the other, brutes, clumsy, half-animal, a species destined to disappear because supposedly they were inferior. But that image does not stand up to even the slightest modern analysis. Neanderthals had brains that were, on average, larger than our own. They weren't hunched over by nature. That posture was a misinterpretation of diseased skeletons. They were robust, strong, and perfectly adapted to the cold climates of Europe and Western Asia. They lived there for more than 300,000 years, long before Homo sapiens ever set foot in that territory. They manufactured sophisticated tools, they controlled fire, they hunted massive, dangerous animals in groups. But what matters most isn't their technology, it's their humanity. Neanderthals cared for the sick and the injured for years, even when they could no longer contribute to the group. That implies cooperation, empathy, and social memory. They buried their dead, in some cases with objects and pigments, suggesting rituals, symbolism, and perhaps a primitive form of spirituality. They weren't a failed version of us, they were another way of being human. And here comes the most uncomfortable fact of all. They didn't disappear completely. When Homo sapiens left Africa and expanded across Eurasia, they interbred with Neanderthals, not once but many times. Today, most humans outside of Africa carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. It is in our immune system, in our skin, in how we respond to certain diseases. Neanderthals live on in us. So the question changes. It's not why did they disappear? It's why did they cease to exist as a separate species and we didn't? Was it competition for resources, cultural differences, diseases, or simply luck? It was probably everything all at once. But there is something Neanderthals make clear. Human history is not the story of a winner crushing a loser. It is the story of branches that cross, that blend, and sometimes dissolve into one another. And just when we think we have understood the limits of human intelligence, a discovery appears that breaks all the rules once again, one that suggests that not even brain size determines our symbolic capacity. In 2013, in South Africa, a group of explorers and paleoanthropologists descended through an extremely narrow crevice into an almost inaccessible underground chamber in the Rising Star cave system. What they found there made no sense. Dozens of human skeletons, not washed in by water, not mixed with the remains of other animals, not scattered at random. They were placed there deliberately. The species was named Homo naledi, and from the very first moment, it shattered every existing model. Homo naledi had a very small brain, comparable to that of the Australopithecines, much smaller than that of Neanderthals, much smaller than our own. According to traditional logic, that should place them in a primitive stage of human behavior. But the context changes everything. The bodies did not get there by accident. The chamber is so deep and so difficult to access that it implies intentionality, planning, and repetition. Someone carried their dead there time and time again. This suggests deliberate burials, rituals, a symbolic behavior that, for decades, we believed was reserved exclusively for large brains like those of Homo sapiens or Neanderthals. Homo naledi forces us to rethink a key idea, that spirituality, symbolism, or the awareness of death depends directly on brain size. Perhaps that isn't the case. Perhaps the capacity to attribute meaning, to ritualize death, or to think of something beyond immediate survival emerges in different ways across different human branches. And here, an even greater surprise appears. Homo naledi is not as ancient as one might expect. Dating indicates that they lived between 236,000 and 335,000 years ago. In other words, at the same time as the first Homo sapiens. While our species was beginning to emerge, another humanity, with a much smaller brain, could already have been performing funerary practices. This destroys the idea of an orderly, progressive, and hierarchical human evolution. There was no single correct way to be human. There were many. Some developed advanced technology. Others developed symbolism. Some did both. Others disappeared, leaving almost no trace. And that leads us inevitably to the final question. If there were so many humanities, if some were longer lived than we are, if others were just as complex in key aspects, why are we alone now?
If we look at the complete tree of humanity, the question is no longer why we exist. The real question is why no one else does. For millions of years, the Earth was inhabited by several human species at the same time. It wasn't an exception, it was the norm. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, Homo erectus in its final stages. Different humanities sharing the planet, sometimes even the same territories. And today, we are all that's left. There is no single clear cause. There was no apocalyptic event that wiped everyone out at once. The disappearance of our cousins was a slow, uneven, and likely multifactorial process. One of the most important factors was direct competition with Homo sapiens. Our species wasn't necessarily stronger or more intelligent in absolute terms, but it did have a crucial advantage: flexibility. Sapiens developed broader social networks, large-scale information exchange, increasingly diverse tools, and an extraordinary capacity to adapt quickly to different environments. Where other species specialized, we generalized. Added to this were diseases. Contact between different human species could have introduced new pathogens for which some populations had no defenses, accelerating their collapse. In other cases, there was no total extinction, but rather genetic assimilation. Neanderthals and Denisovans didn't disappear completely. They mixed with sapiens and became diluted in our DNA. And then there is the most uncomfortable factor of all: chance. Small initial differences, small climate events, droughts, volcanic eruptions, poorly timed migrations. In complex systems, the smallest details can decide the fate of an entire species. Human history is not the story of the strongest, nor the smartest, nor the best. It is the story of the one who survives long enough at the right moment. And that leaves us facing a reality that is difficult to accept. We are not alone because we are special. We are alone because all the other branches broke. And if human evolution has already reset the experiment so many times, the final question is not what happened to them. The question is, how much time do we have before we become just another branch of the lost tree of humanity? After tracing millions of years of human history, one truth remains difficult to ignore. We are not a pure species. We are not the clean result of a single evolutionary line that advanced without interruption to get here. We are a mixture, a genetic mosaic built from encounters, interbreeding, and disappearances. In our DNA live fragments of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and likely other humanities we have never even identified. Not as archaeological curiosities, but as active parts of who we are today. In our immune system, in our adaptation to climate, even in certain traits of our behavior. We are, literally, a living archive of extinct species. This completely changes the traditional narrative. We are not the pinnacle of evolution. We are not the final goal of the process. We are the branch that remained standing after the last great fire. And that should give us pause. For millions of years, human evolution experimented. It tested different paths and produced diverse solutions. Some were extraordinarily long-lived, others were incredibly ingenious, and yet they all disappeared. Nothing guarantees that our story will be different. Technology does not make us invulnerable. Intelligence does not protect us from collapse. Consciousness does not grant us immunity from climate change, pandemics, ecological degradation, or our own capacity for self-destruction. And yet, there is something different this time. For the first time, a human species is aware of its fragility. For the first time, we know that we are not eternal. For the first time, we can look back and see the complete pattern. The question is no longer whether humanity can disappear. We know it can. The question is whether, with all this knowledge, we will be able to break the cycle. Because if the history of humanity has been a book written and burned time and time again, we are not the definitive edition. We are simply the volume that is still open. And what happens in the next few pages is still to be written.